Great, so we're going to dive into the panel, and this is meant to be a great opportunity to share best practices. We'll have some time for questions at the end. So real quick, I've got Rob Evely from the Five College Consortium here, Catherine Zabriskie from Brown University, Jody Fanto from right down the block, and Clayton Hainsworth from edX. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves so they can actually give an accurate view of the world they live in for all of you, and then we'll dive into some more pointed discussion topics. So I'm going to ask each of you, just a quick reminder, quickly tell us your role. What role does video play at your institution? How is it used? If you happen to have had experience with accessibility before your current role, I think that would be interesting for us to hear. And then really quickly just tee up, what's the biggest challenge you've faced so far in getting buy-in for accessibility at your institution? I'm going to ask you not to go into too much more detail other than just teeing it up though. So Rob, okay.
Rob Evely, I'm the Five College Electronic and Information Technology Accessibility Coordinator. It's a fairly new role. The position was posted less than 2 years ago, and I filled as the first person in this position. I should note it's called the Five College position, but I actually worked for 4 schools: Amherst College, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, and Smith colleges. So we're working together to try to kind of beef up our programs for IT accessibility, and by working together is I think we're being more efficient and effective doing this. As far as video accessibility, I think it's a plus that all 4 schools do use Moodle, so this is nice that we're using the same LMS across the 4 schools. We also do have an edX MOOC at one of the schools, and then of course all the schools have publicly facing video and communications and college relations. So accessibility, I've been working in this field for 15 years, including 5 years here at Harvard, and I see some familiar faces, which is a lot of fun. I should note, my last time in this building was my first day on the job here because they used to have new employee orientation. So that's kind of fun. Okay, so I think lastly was the biggest challenge to me. It's all about buy-in, and really, to me, it's very clear that the higher level the buy-in, the more success you're going to have. So it's constantly trying to make sure we have the most buy-in, the best buy-in, and sustained buy-in from the highest level of the institution.
I'm Catherine Zabriskie. I'm the Director of Academic Technology at Brown University. So I have responsibility for delivering services in support of teaching and learning that include online tools like Canvas we use at Brown. I also have responsibility for technology-enabled spaces, and I have responsibility for the media folks. So it's both the people that support installed classroom technology and the media production team. And at Brown, we have a central media production team, but we also have distributed media producers across campus. So video is used in lots of different ways at Brown, probably pretty typical to other institutions. We have an online movie service where we digitize movies and make them available through Canvas. That's a very popular program for our teaching and learning environment. We also create video that's used in support of online courses and hybrid courses and to support the residential courses as well, pretty typical. We have an automatic lecture capture service, and that is used more and more. That's another way in which video is used in our courseware. And of course, we document the academic events that take place at Brown and make that available in support of teaching and learning, as well as getting the word out about the great work that's on at Brown. I had no experience with accessibility before getting involved in the captioning project. Truthfully, someone came to me from our staff employee accessibility services office and asked for help. And I said, all right, let's figure out what we can do, because it seems very important to do this work. But I had no background. Now I've become an advocate, and I often find myself saying, wait, stop, we can't sign up for that vendor because they have no interest in accessibility and no plans for the future. So I feel like I am much more aware than I was before working on the captioning project at Brown. And buy-in, there is intellectual buy-in and commitment, but it's difficult when you start adding up the dollars. And the numbers get big very, very quickly. So I don't think it's for lack of wanting to do it, but that's, I think, been the hardest part around. We were lucky to get some funding for a central project, and now we're trying to figure out how to get the operational funds that we need to continue, because we're just about at the end of our project funds. And that's all, right?
Hello everyone, I'm Jody Fanto. the Director of Software Engineering at Harvard's Division of Continuing Education. So our model is a little different. We have students spread around the globe, so this has some implications. One of which is the video of the lectures and other content is their primary learning vehicle. Many of these students may never step foot in the classroom. So that means things like video quality, captioning quality, and so on become an absolute requirement. So my team builds a system for automatically capturing, processing, and polishing video. Some of our video production folks are here. They're one of our users. Students are obviously another set of our users, and faculty and teaching staff as well. So getting buy-in was actually made considerably easier by two things. First, our dean, Hunt Lampert, is on the board of the Perkins School for the Blind, so he is very invested in this. It makes a huge difference when you have that kind of investment from the top. And then the other is that Harvard got sued. So,
my name's Blake Ainsworth. I run a video team at edX. I think my actual title is Content Production Manager. And edX is an online platform. We use video in every single course. And one of the key missions for edX is providing access to education, but that really comes down to access for content. From the very first course, which I actually was lucky enough to be at MIT and worked on that originally, so worked with Professor Agarwal from the very beginning. Having transcripts as part of the platform was just absolutely critical, and something that it began with that. It was not something that it was because of a legal consideration. It was because it was really around being able to provide content in a way that best suited the students. And what was really interesting in that very first course is that the MIT students, who may not be considered your average student, but they were actually taking the transcripts, downloading them, reading the transcripts, as opposed to watching the content. Because you can read faster. But it really became very much part of the platform, and very much, and that idea of access really predominates throughout our entire platform, and the ability to be able to consume content in different ways. We have a wonderful accessibility person, Mark Sadecki, who's at edX, who does an amazing job getting people to understand it, and it really has become something where we go through training every year, and it's actually quite easy to create accessible content as long as you're creating it with that knowledge ahead of time. Something Larry was saying, I think was really critical, which is being aware of it is this key component of it. Because doing it after the fact can be just absolutely time-consuming, costly, and then you're trying to sort of shoehorn accessibility.
So that's great. So that actually brings up a really interesting point in terms of now you've all dealt with implementing accessibility to some extent. The original driver was clearly accessibility. How has that changed? Is it still accessibility? Are you gathering feedback on how captions or transcripts are being used? Is that changing the way you're doing things in any way?
At least for edX, we certainly have we have tons of data. Now we just need to get to the analysis of that data, or have our partners. And one of the things that we do see is the use of transcriptions and captions, particularly for people with English as a second language, but really thinking about kind of multimodal learning. And that's something that I talk to our partners about quite a bit. The idea where you're not just creating content, and mostly what we're creating is, there's a lot of sort of headshot and slide content, which I'm always suggesting moving away from. But the idea of really creating not a lecture video, but something that is using that image to support what is being said. So whether that's articulating what's on that screen in a manner, so it isn't simply putting words up or bullet points of words up. So really trying to think about really how can we have people learn quicker and be able to have mastery of that content faster. So that really becomes a big part of how we think about it.
I would just say at Brown, we were very much, our project was initiated by our accessibility office, so it's all about accessibility. And I think what we're realizing now is that we need to probably take a little bit more of a universal design approach and actually look at opportunities for focusing on captioning to support various learning styles. It's not just about making content accessible. Of course, that then gets back to the funding and the budget, because it would be expensive for us to caption all the video content that's used in support teaching and learning. But having said that, it feels to me like that's the direction we're going to need to go in the future.
So I'd add, right, that there's accommodation, making sure that we're, accessibility and accommodation, but also if we're going to endorse, say, WCAG 2AA, or just read the EDA or Section 504, it says we need to make this content, we need to make this form of communication of video accessible to all. And so I think this is what we're considering, whether we call it universal access or not, is I think that's what we're looking at.
So there are a couple challenges here. One is to make sure that the accessible implementations are working, one, and then also there's just the technology changes in all this. So let's talk about first looking at accessibility in terms of, is it working, quality. How do you know you're getting what you're expecting? Do you have methods in place to look at this? How do you measure it? What should people be looking for?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. So what's really interesting for us is that we actually require that our partners produce all the captioning. So we have obviously a very close relationship with 3Play, and a lot of them do use that, but they create all different, they use all different methods to create these transcripts. One of the things, and probably one of the best user test case that we have to make sure the quality is there is our students. If it is not there, we hear from our students incredibly quickly. And I'm not even talking about if there's a missing transcript, if something is inaccurate. And what we actually had a lot in the very early days, we actually had course teams that were producing transcripts on their own, caption content that was, say, less than 99% accurate. And they actually had a few that were putting out on a wiki that they asked the students to actually be the ones who reported those issues, and they would go and correct them. So they were essentially using their students to do some crowdsourcing of correction. What we see is that it's just not worth it from a time and budget perspective to do that. And it's better to have a service that you can do spot checks and you are seeing getting that accuracy.
If I may. A couple of thoughts on this. One is we've built a system where transcription captions are just part of the job. It's a requirement. It has to be there. So we actually have sort of a multi-step approach that happens, somewhat progressive, as Larry did, where when a video comes in, our production team polishes it, makes sure it's ready to get published, and then we immediately publish it. At that same time, we send our content to a speech-to-text service. We happen to use IBM Watson's service. And then if a student in that class has registered with the Disabilities Office, or if that class is available to the public, when we publish, we also push to 3Play. And so we push out the Watson captions as fast as possible. They tend to come back a little quicker because there are no humans. And you can see that in the quality of the captions you get back. And then once the results come back from 3Play, we then replace those automated generated captions. This has worked really well for us, and it was kind of an afterthought. We knew we had to provide accessibility for our students with disabilities, but then it actually wasn't that much harder to just provide captions for everybody, just on every video.
So, if you don't mind, tell us more about how you're using the Watson output, because I think the ASR, automatic speech recognition, comes up a lot in really across the board, but especially in education, because it is fast and it's cheap. And so you don't have the same budget challenges that you would, especially if you're producing content at scale. So how has it helped you?
One significant way it's helped us are there are many students who don't have disabilities, or I've heard some people talk about how valuable transcripts are to just regular students, right? All of us. For budgetary reasons, we would be delighted if we could send it all to 3Play and get almost perfect transcriptions, but that's not feasible. So the automated system, Watson in our case, is dramatically cheaper, like pennies a minute. But then you have this trade-off, right? So I see in many places a few different trade-offs. So one thing you're thinking about is the quality of the captions. Another thing you're thinking about is cost. And yet another thing you're thinking about is how fast can I get these results to the student. And honestly, I think each of you, everyone has to evaluate which of these things are most important or most feasible. I like our model, which is, yes, you just do everything.
So how much stuff comes back from Watson, but no one touches it? It just goes up?
All of it. I should extend on his point. That has some downsides, right? Quality isn't always great for some videos. So increasingly we're trying to engage with faculty members, with teaching staff, and give them an opportunity to do some of that editing on their own. Right now, that's pretty manual and pretty intensive. We hope in the next semester or two to have just a little extra button on our player that allows someone to inject a correction. For example, maybe the way to do it is faculty and teaching staff can make those corrections themselves as they want, and without sort of any controls. And then maybe students can suggest things that then are approved by teaching staff. It'll be interesting to see how this model plays out. I would also suggest, though, that having a dedicated team do transcriptions like with 3Play is likely to be better than whatever we can crowdsource.
So you send everything to Watson, and if there's a request from your accessibility office for supporting your work is going public, and you send it to people?
Correct.
Okay.
Do you put a disclaimer on the stuff that's not done just by Watson and all, or just by?
I'm just going to repeat the question for everyone. So it's a really good question, which is, do you put a disclaimer on the Watson-only transcripts for people to understand what they're looking at?
Yes, so we have a little note which says these are automated transcriptions, and there's a mechanism for students then to register if they have an ADA responsibility, because they are different. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the implementation.
I want to ask Judy about the video content on your platform. How persistent is it? Is the large majority of it video that's going to be watched by the students enrolled in that semester and then possibly not by nobody ever again? Or will you have a class that takes place in the fall, let's say, that video content will be preserved and reused for future enrolled students in the spring, the following fall, etc.?
So the question is, how much does the content persist? And is it a one and done class, or is that content reusable year after year?
So I usually think of it in terms of we want to provide our faculty and teaching staff as many options as fits their particular course. So certainly there are some classes where a faculty member teaches for that semester. Those videos are only accessible to students in that class that semester. And then if they teach again in the future, they just produce another set of videos. One in-between step is we allow faculty to republish videos from past semesters. And sometimes that's done on an entire course basis. It's also, I think one neat way that it's applied is, let's say there's a snow day or the faculty member gets the flu, they can republish the video from last year, which gets students, so then the students don't lose any time during the semester. We're also starting to work, actually, Greg Amo and Christian Wise Carver in the audience from our production team. They're working on totally flipped classrooms, so courses that last for many years potentially. And in most of those cases, the videos are chopped up into small 5-minute chunks or something like that. So I guess my answer is yes.
If I could just add at Brown, we have a similar policy, but one thing we're doing is if a faculty member is developing content, whether it's for a flipped course or just to augment, then we go ahead and get them in the workflow to have it captioned through FreePlay. They may or may not use that content again, but it's so much more efficient to have it captioned at that time that we think that's worth that. So for faculty generated content, we go ahead and caption it.
You
I have a question for Catherine. You said you had a deployment of lecture capture.
Yes.
Is the captioning done reactively or proactively for those?
If there is a student in the course who is registered with our accessibility office, then we proactively caption all that content for that course. We don't do it for all of the lecture capture. It can be a student that has requested it.
Thank you.
So talking about lecture capture is a good segue into the technology side of this. So, there's making video content accessible, there's making course content accessible. Catherine, you mentioned UDL before. What are the big challenges when you get this off the ground? You're saying we're going to make course content accessible. Like Clayton, you mentioned you're doing it from the beginning. What are some of the considerations to make this work from a technical perspective that are either going to hit everyone at some point, or just were the challenges you happen to face?
I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges, which is back to this idea of persistent content, is just the amount of video content that can be created, which quickly outpaces any budget or any ability for people to view. One of my producers was looking at some video metrics, and something like if you were to try and watch all the video content on the edX platform, it would take you like 25 years already, or something like that. It's probably even more than that at this point. But the idea that that it's embedded, it becomes part of it, and that there are automated ways of doing this, so it doesn't require somebody to go in and check every single link to go in. For us, we have we initially started with a system that was extremely manual. We actually were using a format that wasn't even the standard format. And FreePlay created a version of that file for us. We're now using standard SRT files, thank goodness. But a lot of it really comes around how do I make sure that when I create this content and it goes out to caption and it comes back, that there's a way of marrying it back up, that functionally works, and that you're not sitting there trying to search through, because a lot of this content, this was I think mentioned earlier, isn't cataloged at an institutional level, right? And so it needs to be cataloged, or it needs to be some sort of digital asset management, either within a system or within the institution. But most of the institutions we work with do not have that as a function.
Our biggest challenge has not been technical. The integrations with our lecture capture are excellent. It's just more policy, and like as you were saying, and there's starting to add up the amount of content you expect to create gets overwhelming, and then you remember, are we going to go back and caption the content we already have, and then it gets completely overwhelming. So I think the lesson learned is to try to bring people around the table as early in the process you just talk through, and the idea of creating, we try to create guidelines around that policy. So the idea of coming up with some guidelines early on that you're willing to tweak as you need to. Because you don't want to scare people, you want them to be captioning it. We want to do the right thing. If it's going to go public, if it's something that's going to be widely accessed on our website, we absolutely want to caption, no questions asked. So you don't want people to get nervous about doing it.
And you also end up in conversations around metadata tagging, and so this video, and this is, I think about this side of things a little bit, is our partners produce content. They create a piece of video, and then we create all these assets from it. I don't want them to think about, oh, is this the mobile video, is this the transcript? I want them to think about, this is the video with all those assets that go with it. We're not quite there yet, but to really be able to think about that not as these are the different pieces that make up that content, but rather this is the single identifier for that content. It includes all these other assets that become really necessary for accessible content.
If I could just emphasize, I do think the amount of video you're going to need to process, your students are going to demand, your faculty are going to want to use, is only going to increase, right? It's amazing that there's more room to increase, but there's significant room. So you really need to think about volume. Processes that might work when you have a few hundreds of hours of content start to crumble when you have a few thousands or tens of thousands. And then, of course, the other thing is students, our users, students and faculty members and so on, are very demanding. They want video as fast, absolutely as fast as possible. It's never fast enough. They want high quality captions. They just want it all immediately. And I don't think their demands are going to decrease.
Just speak to a couple things there. So what Jody said is one of the campuses I'm working with is their model for their budget for captioning is to double it every year. They're sort of crunching the numbers and coming up with it. They're just saying, well, what can we put forth? And they don't get it approved fully. Maybe they do, but that's their model. Double. This idea of policy and guidelines I think is really important. Before we get to technical challenges, is to faculty know that we need to do this. They're getting the message from the right people in the institution, and are we supporting them? Even if if we just have an unlimited 3-play budget, they still would need some help probably. Just they need support on how to, with workflows to make sure they get their captioning in place. So for the schools that I'm working with is we're looking top level IT accessibility policy with a P, capital P, a policy, and then beneath that there's guidelines. So captioning guidelines, other guidelines. Getting a policy approved is very, very, very hard, but we're looking really good actually with the 5 colleges right now with each institution.
One thing I want to just quickly add is what's also, so I've been at edX pretty much for its entirety, and when we first had partners joining us, they would do captioning. We have to have captions, and we almost never have that conversation anymore. So the prevalence of it, just the awareness of it, is significant because a lot of institutions have at least some amount of this going on. Obviously, it's from your research, maybe not a well-communicated policy, but they're aware of it. And particularly when they come to edX and go through our training, it's one of the first things that gets mentioned. So, and there's very few people who are like, what is this, why am I doing this? It's simply, it's just accepted.
If I could just add one thing, I do think getting the content creators involved and thinking about accessibility and doing some of the work around that is really critical. It's also important in terms of scale.
So how do you do that? How have you all addressed that awareness, that information sharing? Because you're at a certain layer in the institution, and there's a big population of faculty trying to do this. So how do you get that message out?
A few messages. One is the Disabilities Office sends out some messages. Our production team is also developing sort of some training models, videos essentially for faculty members to understand the importance of it, but in particular how to do it really well. We find that if you can get faculty engaged, their standards tend to be very high, and so you need to have mechanisms to support that.
Like I said, we target provost or dean of faculty that comes out of our tech access committee that's charged by the president, and then we just get this top-down message to say this is important, this is something lesson learned.
And we do the opposite. We do a grassroots ground up. So we have a working group, audio, video users group that's been in place forever, and it's just the people that are making video that talk to each other, and then they wind up talking to instructional designers and other people, and then have to hear the faculty.
So we're not absent that. We definitely have that. We've got a good amount of chatter from a lot of folks. So I take that's a good point.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just had kind of a curiosity. I'm wondering, from some of the students now that know that there's accessible content, right, for courses out there. Now that there's more of an awareness, has there been an increase, I'm just wondering, has there been an increase of people that have complained that there's content that's not accessible, or because there's more accessible content, are there less complaints? Does that make sense?
So really, yeah, really interesting question. With the increase of content that's been made accessible, have there been more requests from other students requesting that their content be made accessible when not, because they're now more aware? Or is it quite the opposite? Is it that the requests are going down because it's happening more often?
In our experience, students are very demanding. So if they find out about a feature which is better in the course, they want to know about it. But I will say we have preempted some of that by just applying transcripts first.
So sort of the more that you give, the more that they want, is that? All right, just.
Yeah, and I can share a story. We have, so we have all these integrations with lecture capture systems. We actually were working with a group to bypass the easy-to-use integration, specifically to not make everyone aware, knowing that the request would flood in.
Wow.
Which this was a few years ago, when things were just getting going for them, but they knew what was going to come if everyone had access to it.
Do we know if there's like an increase of litigation, or is it a decrease? Or
So it's a great question. So the question is there an increase in litigation? So let's talk a little bit about that. Maybe not specifically litigation, but how much does the law factor into the way you guys are doing this in terms of, Rob, you mentioned WCAG 2.0, and there's certainly other laws in place. Was that ever a trigger or a driver for any of you? Is it something you pay attention to?
Okay, so to me the big trigger is the ADA, right? And then the next trigger was the Dear Colleague letter, FAQ. I think reading the book reader letter wasn't as big a deal as reading the frequently asked questions. It said it's all emerging technologies equally effective, equally integrated. And I remember that was, I think, 2011, and that to me was a really big trigger.
Mostly have any effect on you guys?
So Berkeley, the free content stuff, the most recent version. No, it didn't. I have to say. Something else I do want to point out, because I go to conferences and talk to someone from the Department of Education, OCR, and I told her I was having trouble finding some agreements, and she showed me where they were specifically on the website. And this is within the last month I realized how many web accessibility complaints and agreements are there that I never heard of. This is something that I've actually kind of feel like I've been tracking, and all of a sudden I said there are 10 institutions of higher ed that I've never heard of. So I think get back to the question of are there complaints? Are the complaints still coming? The answer is yes, and I think we'll hear more about that. There's some folks, right? There's a couple individuals that are actually submitting a bundle of complaints, and I know that's K through 12, and apparently they're transitioning into higher ed now. And these are in the hundreds. This is where Office of Civil Rights hired an individual to handle this one person's complaint. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes with higher ed.
I think we're very aware of the litigation against our peers, and but to be honest, it's captioning is just one component of accessibility. So I think to some degree, we have a very great director of our accessibility office, and she's very reasonable. She tries to remind us that we need to do the right thing, we need to do this, and it's the law, but we have so many other ways in which we need to improve our accessibility on our campus. So that's not to say, but we can't let it paralyze us. I think our message is, when we talk to other institutions, is you have to start somewhere. So, and I think her feeling has been that putting an effort in does help you if you were to be in a situation where there were a lawsuit. Ignoring it and pretending that it doesn't exist and that you can't do anything would not help you. So I think we definitely are very aware of it.
If I could say, so getting sued or having law that argues you must do something is a great way to get budget. But on a more positive or proactive proactive basis. Larry was talking about how they're pushing the boundaries of trying to get transcripts everywhere and on all devices and this sort of thing. I would phrase it a little differently. I would say if you have effective quality captions and transcripts, your product is better.
Yeah, I mean, for NX, our responsibility is to make sure that the platform is accessible, and it's our partner's responsibility to make sure the content is accessible. And that sort of delineation is very clear. And we have been working with the Department of Justice to make sure that we are compliant. And one of the big areas for us has been just making sure everything is translated, everything's tagged appropriately, which isn't captioning per se, but then making sure that our providers of content really are, they take it seriously, and that, ultimately the responsibility lies with them, and making sure that right from the beginning, contractually they're aware of that, with some of the way our agreements are structured and the way that we talk about it. But I think the more important piece is not, oh, you have to do this because now you're in compliance, but rather this is where you should be because it's a differentiator, because it makes the content better. And while it does probably help you get a budget, as far as like this actually puts you in a better position for this content to succeed, whatever your reasons for wanting that content to succeed on.
So that's great, and I think a number of you have pointed out rightfully so that video is one part of this. So let's talk about that. What's the next wave of accessibility challenges that you're facing? Would it be video related or not? What are you seeing as the next big hurdle that you're about to tackle?
Well, hopefully you're calculating for us. And audio description is really one of the biggest areas, particularly around video content. And one of the things that can be a real challenge, and that can be a real challenge retroactively, trying to make this content accessible. I had the opportunity of talking with lots of video creators to try and get there before they're trying to do this after the fact, right? And this idea of, are you voicing what's actually on screen? Are you actually creating, are you doing the best practice of actual content creation? Are you thinking about multimodal, content, both image-wise as well as language-wise, whether that's written text or that's verbally spoken text, but really thinking about, not doing things like, as you can see on the screen, maybe you can, right? And again, a lot of that is awareness, and a lot of that really comes at that early stage, and building that into, how I think about it as pre-production or planning or whatever it is, but it really is around being able to provide, and this is maybe less so around educational content, because the context may not become as critical, especially if you're doing sort of talking head kind of lecture content. But as you start pushing the boundary of what educational content is, and you're trying to think of more narrative and stuff where that context becomes really critical, that's where it gets really important to be able to be thinking about this way upstream.
I think it's a great point. Faculty education with this, if they're making videos, is have them just speak in a descriptive way as far as any visual components.
So I'll also put in a plug for audio descriptions of things that are on the screen. Absolutely, a few people have mentioned getting the content creators invested in it, because arguably they're in the best position to describe the content. But that's a challenge. You can't rely simply on their efforts, on their remembering. I think another challenge going forward is just keeping pace with the variety and types of devices and contexts in which video arise. And then also, we've encountered some cases recently where it's for students with multiple disabilities. So students, for example, for which Braille is really what they need.
And technology's hurt, right? This idea with a player that's going to work best for captioning and audio description. Were you saying something, Clayton? You got something to work?
There's there's a hackathon project going on tomorrow, I think. Mark, again, who's our accessibility person, when he came from the W3C, over to edX, and he's very passionate about all accessibility, but really around the idea of creating different ways of consuming content. And one of the biggest challenges that we have is the way that we have implemented the player on our platform. So there are ways where you can be accessible, but they're not the most elegant ways. And what we really want to, what he's really interested in is more elegant way, a player that can allow it to display an additional audio caption, as well as the caption file, as well as the audio, and a screen reader to be able to kind of deal with these different inputs, so that it's and again, that it's in a standardized way that it's across all of our platform, but more specifically, it could be across kind of a greater standard of players throughout where content's consumed.
So you mentioned a couple things there that are interesting. One is the elegance, and the other is hacking. So,
Yep.
So on the elegant side of things, which
That might be a
really,
shorter answer.
well, so that's that's really important when you're trying to scale, right? So if you're trying to standardize a process and really deliver content to, in some cases, maybe millions of eyeballs, elegance is critical. But some people here maybe don't have the luxury of being able to develop a product that way. So from a hack perspective, if we're thinking about clever ways to get it done and just get something going, and sometimes something's better than nothing, what are some quick tips that people can say, this is a way to make content more accessible than it was yesterday?
I mean, one of the ways that I think about it is again, you get into this space where it really becomes the content creators who are the critical components, right? They're the ones who actually can describe this thing. I would joke that I have editors, but they're not nuclear physicists, right? They're not making content decisions. They're cleaning up humps and ums at various points. And so thinking about ways, and this sort of gets back, you can be in compliance, but it's not an elegant solution. But that ultimately makes the product worse, right? Whether it's a platform or whether it's just a user experience. So finding a way to first meet that sort of requirement, but always kind of continuing to push beyond that to think of ways where this is something that I could see people wanting across a much broader range, right? And ultimately getting to that more elegant solution. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of actual answers, but that's really, I think that's again, in any kind of UX and user design for any platform is just really critical. And I think that's relying on vendors to some degree to help come up with some of those solutions as well.
I don't necessarily have hacks or even technology hacks. These are just a couple lessons learned working with 4 small liberal arts colleges. We have different buckets of money for captioning. This idea, though, I really like this of assigning a campus captioning captain. Right? We're not all CU Boulder where we have a full-time position of the captioning coordinator. So just someone that knows what's going on and can answer questions. So if a question comes up, they say, oh, well, here's how communications does it. Here's how we're doing it in educational technologies. It's been really helpful to have, because there's this question. It's always like, well, who knows? Who knows across campus, what's going on? So I'd say that was a really big lesson learned. Another one is to find budgets that exist that you can use for captioning, and there were some of these then. So in educational technologies, we had a line item called educational supplies. In communications, we had digital services was a line item. So we're using these for captioning. And just one more thing to throw on top there is, with Prepay is, you can prepay. So at the end of the fiscal year, you can actually, you've got some leftover money, you can prepay and then have some captioning in the following fiscal year.
So let's keep going on the lessons learned, and then we'll open it up for questions. What are 1 or 2 lessons learned now that you've been through quite a bit of going from the way it was to the way it is today? What have been some major things that stand out for you?
I think I would build on the idea of this campus captioning captain. We formed a working group of members from across the campus in order to get Replay, to identify the right vendor, and then work with Replay. And that, somebody from our accessibility office, a media person from my team, a couple other people are in that team, and we continue that small working group. We have a email distribution, so when there's questions, they come to all of us, and we have slightly different takes on, so then we can come around and talk amongst ourselves about the question and the inquiry and the need for more information. So I think it's a similar idea of trying to make it easy for people to know who to go to ask questions, but not worry about it being one person or always having the answers. It's as much about having the conversation. So anything you can do to connect disparate offices, I think, would be useful.
I think one of the lessons that we learned is we really need to automate everything. Once video is going to continue to increase in volume, you have to be prepared for that. I guess another thing I would say is this is not a trivial challenge, right? You have to put real work in. You have to work with partners who do some of the heavy lifting. But what you get out is better for your students with disabilities, but also for everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I was very much in that same, it's workflow. And again, I come very much from that media side of things where if I'm dragging and dropping or tracking something in the spreadsheet, I'm doing it wrong. And again, particularly with the sort of, let's say, organic growth of the edX platform, there was a lot of very manual steps that we've over time automated out, but there's still plenty more that can be done. And a lot of this also gets back to just kind of other, and again, talking about the sort of media side of things, media workflows, whether that's using, an Adobe product or, whatever you're using, and making sure that, you're kind of continually investigating what are the steps you're doing, what are the manual processes, and how can I change those so that I can be more efficient. Because there's the cost of captioning, and, that great slide about the price of this coming down for an hour of content. But then if you think about it in sort of, people time or human time, if you're doing manual process, it gets so much more expensive.
Great, so let's open it up for some questions. Go ahead.
You never know who's hard of hearing in the room. So the question is, what are your institutions doing, if anything at all, in terms of live streaming? That's the big thing right now, making live streaming content accessible. Thanks, Josh.
Luckily, for the most part, for edX content, we don't actually do a lot of live streaming. As far as in my previous life, and my old manager, Elaine, is here, who actually oversaw the streaming. We used to do live captioning of commencement at MIT.
You do live captioning of edX.
Do you?
Yeah, I was shown.
Oh, sure. Okay. And luckily, I don't actually know all of the 1,600 courses, but there are some, and it's using different sort of size resources, but predominantly we're not dealing with a lot of live streaming content. So that's sort of a very me backing away from that question.
Are you asking how we do it, or do we do it?
How? Or how?
I can tell you that we do it, but I can't tell you how, but I can get you information.
Fair enough.
I can tell you how we do that. I'm from MIT, so I handle distance education and streaming. For live edX courses or live institute events, we have a caption encoder. We actually contract with a company that connects to that encoder. If we can get the scripts to them ahead of time, like in the commencement, we will do so. Otherwise, they just very happy fingers and very good people. But it's $145 an hour to do that, as an example. Not including the streaming.
Question, yep.
My question is, you keep talking about content creation, and I want to know how people are handling the explosion of content use that's not created on campus, links to everybody, and there are also untext and video.
Great, yeah, so talking about content creation, so that is obviously one challenge, but there's also a challenge that people are bringing content in from outside the campus campus walls. How are we doing with that?
We caption movies if we don't have the version of the movie that has the subtitles with it. We also have faculty that find YouTube videos and they want them captioned. We will reach out to the producer of the video to ask them if we can caption it, and then we caption it and make it available for YouTube. So we do our best to caption the third-party content.
Is that faculty saying they've got a YouTube link, or, right,
How do we know about it?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think typically it's a course that we're already involved in, so there's probably lots of examples where it's not taking place. We do a lot of consulting with faculty that are using media for teaching and learning, so it might be a relationship that we already have, and we can say, wait a second, you're using all this other content, let's look at how we can caption it.
Do you find that YouTube publishers are responsive?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no, and sometimes we just do it anyway, even though that might be unethical, we just do it so we have the captions.
Jody and Clayton, you have all public facing, so questions on you. Okay, so Rob, yeah. In addition to public facing, do you record live classes and have those captures online, only students registered for the course behind pin protection? And if you do have that, do you capture those?
We do, and we don't caption all of them. We record lectures and content within the class, and then we will caption those for courses that a student has registered with our accessibility office.
Kathy and I have a follow-up to that.
Sure.
So if you have let's say one of those courses, it meets Tuesday, Thursday, are the captions for Tuesday done before, so they could watch the video before Thursday meets?
Yes.
So you're paying the premium price for quick turnaround for?
Well, we usually get them turned around pretty quickly without the premium. I don't know if that's
I thought 4 business days was like the default.
Yeah, I think we get them turned around more quickly than that usually. I don't know if I should be saying, I'm looking at you. I don't know, I think it's usually, we try to make them available. We are respectful of the fact that it's not that helpful if they have to wait a week or two. So I can go back and look and see whether we're putting in the rush, but I think usually we have pretty good service turnaround.